This photograph you are seeing now might appear to be merely another Victorian family portrait from 1882. Three children arranged formally in their finest clothes, two boys flanking their younger sister, all displaying the solemn expressions typical of the era's lengthy photographic exposures. But if you look more closely, if you truly observe the details that most people prefer to ignore, you will begin to perceive something profoundly disturbing about the way these siblings are positioned. The protective stance of the older brother, the possessive grip of the younger boy's hand on his sister's shoulder, the trapped expression barely concealed behind the girl's practiced smile. This is not simply a portrait of three children from a prosperous family. This is the final documentation of the Ashford siblings before one of them vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions that would torment their family for generations. The story behind this innocent-looking photograph goes far beyond what any family history would dare to record, revealing how the bonds between siblings can become something far more sinister than love or protection. To fully understand the extraordinary and disturbing story of the Ashford children, we need to dive into the context of rural Yorkshire in 1882. The moors of northern England stretched endlessly in all directions, from isolated manor houses, creating landscapes where wealthy families lived in virtual isolation from their neighbours. It was a world where eccentricity could flourish unchecked, where family secrets could be buried as deeply as bodies in the ancient graveyards that dotted the windswept hills. Blackmore House had been the Ashford family seat for over 2 centuries, an imposing Gothic manor that rose from the Yorkshire moors like a monument to generations of accumulated wealth and social position. The estate encompassed thousands of acres of wild moorland, maintained by a small army of groundskeepers and servants who lived in cottages scattered across the property's boundaries. Sir Edmund Ashford, master of Blackmore House, had built his fortune through strategic investments in the growing railway industry. His wife, Lady Catherine Ashford, came from an old Northumberland family whose bloodline could be traced back to the Norman conquest. Together, they had created what appeared to be the perfect Victorian household, prosperous, respectable, and blessed with 3 healthy children who represented the family's continued prosperity. The Ashford children seemed to embody everything that Victorian society valued in young people. Edmund Jr., the eldest at 14, showed every sign of following his father's path toward business success and social leadership. He was intelligent, well-educated, and already demonstrating the kind of commanding presence that would serve him well in adult life. Charles, 12 years old, was quieter than his older brother, but equally intelligent, with a particular gift for mathematics and engineering that suggested a bright future in the family's railway interests. But it was their sister Margaret, 10 years old in 1882, who was considered the crown jewel of the Ashford family, beautiful, graceful, and possessed of the kind of innocent charm that made her the centre of attention at every social gathering. Margaret seemed destined for an advantageous marriage that would further cement the family's social position. The decision to commission a formal portrait of the 3 children was made in the spring of 1882, partly to commemorate their growing maturity, and partly to create a permanent record of the family's continued success. Such portraits were essential symbols of Victorian prosperity, designed to be displayed prominently in the family home and to serve as evidence of proper child-rearing and domestic harmony. The photographer chosen for this important commission was Mr. Silas Hartwell, one of Yorkshire's most distinguished portrait artists. Hartwell had established his reputation through his work with the region's aristocratic families, creating formal portraits that captured not just physical likenesses, but the essential character and social standing of his subjects. Hartwell's equipment was transported to Blackmore House in early June, as the photographer preferred to work in familiar environments where his young subjects would be most comfortable. The portrait session was scheduled to take place in the manor's main drawing room, where the natural lighting and elegant furnishings would provide an appropriate backdrop for the family's social aspirations. The session began on a Tuesday morning, with all 3 children dressed in their finest formal attire. Edmund Jr. wore a dark wool jacket and crisp white collar that emphasized his emerging maturity. Charles was dressed identically to his older brother, creating a visual harmony that spoke to their shared heritage and future responsibilities. Margaret wore an elaborate white dress with intricate lacework, her golden hair arranged in careful curls that framed her delicate features. Hartwell worked with the methodical precision for which he was known, carefully positioning each child to create the most flattering and meaningful composition. The arrangement he chose was both traditional and symbolic. Edmund Jr. standing protectively behind his younger siblings, Charles positioned to his sister's right with one hand resting on her shoulder, and Margaret seated in the centre, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. But as the session progressed, Hartwell began to notice something unusual about the children's interactions that made him increasingly uncomfortable. While Edmund Jr. maintained the dignified pose expected of him, there was an intensity in his gaze when he looked at Margaret that seemed inappropriate for a brother's protective affection. It was possessive in a way that suggested ownership rather than family love. Charles's behaviour was even more troubling. His hand on Margaret's shoulder maintained a grip that was too tight, too controlling for simple sibling affection. When Margaret attempted to shift her position slightly to be more comfortable, Charles's fingers pressed more firmly, keeping her exactly where he wanted her to remain. Most disturbing of all was Margaret's reaction to her brother's behaviour. Instead of the natural complaints or resistance that would be expected from a 10-year-old girl being controlled by her siblings, she submitted to their positioning with a resignation that suggested long practice with such treatment. Her smile, when it appeared, seemed practiced and hollow, as if she had learned to display happiness regardless of her actual feelings. Hartwell, as a professional photographer accustomed to managing difficult family dynamics during portrait sessions, attempted to address what he perceived as simple sibling tensions. Perhaps the young gentlemen could relax their positions slightly, he suggested diplomatically. Miss Margaret appears to be somewhat uncomfortable, and a more natural arrangement might produce a better photographic result. The response to this suggestion was immediate and revealing. Both boys turned toward Hartwell with expressions of such cold hostility that the photographer instinctively stepped back from his camera. "Margaret is perfectly comfortable exactly as she is," Edmund Jr. said in a voice that carried unmistakable menace despite his young age. "We know how to position our sister better than anyone else possibly could." Charles nodded in agreement, his grip on Margaret's shoulder tightening visibly. "She belongs with us, exactly where we've placed her. No one else understands what's best for Margaret." Margaret herself said nothing during this exchange, but Hartwell noticed that she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to become invisible while her brothers established their authority over both her and the photographic process. Despite his growing unease about the family dynamics he was witnessing, Hartwell was a professional who understood the importance of satisfying his wealthy clients. He completed the portrait session according to the children's preferences, creating the formal image they demanded while privately documenting his concerns in his professional journal. The resulting photograph was technically perfect, capturing every detail with the clarity and precision that made Hartwell's work so highly valued. But there was something in the image that disturbed everyone who saw it, though few could articulate exactly what seemed wrong about the composition. The protective stance of the older brother appeared somehow threatening rather than caring. The younger brother's hand on his sister's shoulder looked more like a restraint than an affectionate gesture, and Margaret's expression, while appropriately demure for a Victorian child, carried undertones of resignation and fear that seemed inappropriate for a family portrait. When Hartwell delivered the finished photograph to Blackmore House 2 weeks later, the children's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. They gathered around the image with obvious satisfaction, commenting on how perfectly it captured their relationship as siblings. "It shows exactly how we take care of Margaret," Edmund Jr. said with obvious pride. "Everyone will understand that she belongs with us, that we're responsible for keeping her safe and proper." Charles nodded approvingly, studying the photograph with the intensity of someone examining a legal document. "No one could mistake our commitment to our sister after seeing this portrait. It proves that we know what's best for her." Margaret's response was more subdued, but she agreed that the portrait accurately represented their family relationship. "My brothers do take very good care of me," she said in a small voice. "They make sure I never do anything that might harm the family's reputation." Sir Edmund and Lady Catherine Ashford received the portrait with appropriate satisfaction, praising Hartwell's technical skill. and commenting on how well the image captured their children's characters. Neither parent seemed to notice the troubling undertones that had disturbed the photographer, or perhaps they chose to interpret the boy's possessive behavior as appropriate masculine protectiveness. The portrait was hung in a place of honor in the main drawing room, where it could be admired by visitors and serve as a permanent record of the family's domestic harmony. The image quickly became a topic of conversation among the local gentry, praised for both its technical excellence and its representation of proper sibling relationships. But servants at Blackmore House began to report observations that suggested the portrait had captured something far more sinister than simple family affection. The children's behavior toward each other, particularly the boys' treatment of their sister, seemed to become more controlling and possessive after the portrait was completed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the family's longtime housekeeper, documented several incidents in letters to her sister that revealed the true nature of the siblings' relationship. Margaret was rarely allowed to be alone, with one or both of her brothers constantly supervising her activities and controlling her interactions with other people. "The poor child is like a bird in a cage," Mrs. Whitmore wrote. "Her brothers watch her every movement, decide what she can wear, what she can read, even what she can eat. They claim it's for her own protection, but there's something hungry in the way they look at her, something that makes my skin crawl." The boys had also become increasingly secretive about their activities with Margaret, taking her on long walks across the moors where no servants could observe their interactions. These expeditions could last for entire days, with the 3 children returning to the house after dark, Margaret appearing exhausted and subdued, while her brothers seemed energized and satisfied. Even more disturbing were reports from groundskeepers who occasionally glimpsed the children during these moorland wanderings. They described seeing Margaret walking between her brothers like a prisoner being escorted, her movements controlled and directed by their constant physical guidance. Thomas Ashworth, the estate's head groundskeeper, reported one particularly unsettling observation to Mrs. Whitmore. "I saw them yesterday near the old stone circle, the one that's been there since before memory. The boys had the little miss positioned in the centre of the stones, and they were walking around her in circles, speaking words I couldn't make out. She stood perfectly still the whole time, like a statue, while I don't know what they were doing, but it didn't look like any children's game I've ever seen." As autumn approached, the children's behaviour became even more unusual. Edmund Jr. and Charles began displaying knowledge of subjects far beyond what their tutors had taught them, particularly regarding what they called family traditions and ancient responsibilities. They spoke about concepts and practices that seemed to relate to forms of occult knowledge that had no place in a Victorian household. Most alarming was their increasing discussion of Margaret's special purpose within the family and their role as her guardians, in something they referred to as an important family ceremony that needed to be completed before her 11th birthday. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to learn more about this ceremony were met with responses that convinced her the children were involved in something deeply disturbing. The boys spoke about their sister as if she were not a person, but a valuable object that belonged to them, something that would fulfill a family obligation that had been generations in the making. Margaret herself seemed to have accepted her brother's control completely, displaying none of the normal resistance or independence typical of children her age. She moved through her days like a sleepwalker, following her brother's instructions without question and showing no interest in activities that didn't include their supervision. The situation at Blackmore House was approaching a crisis that none of the adults in the household fully understood, but which the portrait had somehow captured with disturbing accuracy. The image that had been created to celebrate the family's children had instead documented the beginning of something that would challenge everything the family thought they knew about the bonds between siblings. The innocent-looking portrait hanging in the drawing room was about to become evidence of secrets that the Ashford family had kept buried for generations. Secrets that would finally surface when one of the 3 children depicted in the photograph vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions that would never be satisfactorily answered. The autumn of 1882 brought changes to Blackmore House that would have alarmed any observer capable of seeing past the family's carefully maintained facade of Victorian propriety. What the household staff had initially dismissed as unusually protective behavior between siblings was evolving into something that challenged the fundamental understanding of family relationships and the bonds that should exist between brothers and sister. The transformation was most visible in the way Edmund Jr. and Charles controlled every aspect of Margaret's daily existence. What had once been presented as brotherly protection had become a form of imprisonment that isolated the 10-year-old girl from all contact with the outside world, except through her brother's careful supervision. Margaret was no longer permitted to speak with servants unless one of her brothers was present to monitor the conversation. Her correspondence was read and frequently confiscated before it could be sent. Even her meals were controlled, with Edmund Jr. and Charles determining what she could eat and when she could take her meals. Mrs. Whitmore documented these restrictions in increasingly alarmed letters to her sister, describing a household where a child was being systematically isolated and controlled by siblings who claimed to be acting in her best interests. The boys have convinced their parents that Margaret needs special protection because of her delicate constitution, she wrote in September 1882. They cite medical authorities and family traditions that supposedly require such careful supervision. But I see the fear in the child's eyes and the hunger in theirs. This isn't protection, it's something much darker. The parents, Sir Edmund and Lady Catherine, seemed genuinely convinced that their son's behaviour represented appropriate masculine responsibility for their sister's welfare. Victorian society encouraged boys to take protective roles towards female family members, and the intensity of Edmund Jr. and Charles's concern could be interpreted as exemplary rather than troubling. But the household staff began to notice that the boys' control over Margaret was accompanied by changes in their own behaviour that suggested something far more disturbing than simple protectiveness. Both boys had begun displaying knowledge and interests that seemed inappropriate for their ages and educational backgrounds. Edmund Jr., in particular, had developed an obsession with what he called family history that focused on practices and traditions that had no place in respectable Victorian discourse. He spoke knowledgeably about ancient rituals, supernatural beliefs, and forms of power that could be acquired through proper understanding of what he termed natural laws. Charles supported his older brother's interests with an intensity that seemed to border on religious devotion. The two boys would spend hours in the estate's library, studying books that their parents had never seen them read, taking detailed notes about subjects that seemed to have no connection to their conventional education. The most troubling aspect of their studies was the way they related their newfound knowledge to Margaret's role in what they increasingly described as their family destiny. They spoke about her as if she were not their sister, but a crucial component in some larger design that they were working to fulfill. Dr. William Pembroke, the family physician who had attended the Ashford children since their births, became concerned when he observed the effects of the boys' control over Margaret during a routine medical examination in October 1882. The child showed signs of chronic stress and malnourishment that were inconsistent with the wealthy family's resources and stated concern for her welfare. Margaret appears to be suffering from what I can only describe as prolonged nervous exhaustion, Dr. Pembroke confided to Mrs. Whitmore after his examination. Her physical condition suggests someone who has been under considerable strain for an extended period. But when I questioned the boys about her care, they provided explanations that were both detailed and disturbing in their sophistication. Edmund Jr. and Charles had developed elaborate justifications for every aspect of Margaret's restricted lifestyle, citing medical theories and family traditions that seemed designed to legitimize their control over her. They spoke about her special sensitivities and inherited vulnerabilities that required constant supervision and protection from outside influences that might harm her delicate constitution. More disturbing still was their demonstration of knowledge about Margaret's physical and psychological condition that seemed to exceed what brothers should know about their sister. They could describe her symptoms, predict her reactions, and explain her needs with a precision that suggested they had been studying her with scientific intensity. Dr. Pembroke's attempts to speak with Margaret privately were frustrated by the boys' insistence that she was too fragile to handle individual questioning without their supportive presence. When he finally managed to examine her alone, her responses were so carefully rehearsed that they provided no insight into her actual condition or feelings. "My brothers take very good care of me," Margaret repeated whenever Dr. Pembroke asked about her welfare. "They understand what I need better than anyone else could. I trust them completely to make the right decisions about my health and happiness." But there were moments during the examination when Margaret's mask slipped, revealing glimpses of the terrified child beneath the carefully maintained surface. Her eyes would dart nervously toward the door where her brothers waited, and she would flinch when Dr. Pembroke moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. Most telling was her reaction when the physician asked about her future plans and aspirations. Margaret's face went completely blank, as if the concept of having personal desires or goals was incomprehensible to her. "I don't think about such things," she said in a voice so empty that it chilled Dr. Pembroke. "My brothers will decide what's best for me when the time comes. They always know what I should do." The doctor's attempts to alert Sir Edmund and Lady Catherine to their daughter's condition met with polite but firm resistance. The parents had been thoroughly convinced by their son's arguments that Margaret required special care and protection that only her brothers could properly provide. "Edmund Jr. and Charles have studied their sister's needs extensively," Sir Edmund explained to Dr. Pembroke. "They've consulted medical texts, researched family history, and developed comprehensive plans for ensuring her welfare. Their devotion to Margaret's well-being is exemplary, and we trust their judgment completely." Lady Catherine was equally supportive of her son's role in their sister's care. "The boys understand Margaret in ways that others cannot," she said with obvious pride. "They've always been sensitive to her special nature, and their protection has kept her safe from influences that might have damaged a child of her delicate temperament." As winter approached, the intensity of the boys' control over Margaret began to escalate in ways that created genuine concern among the household staff. The children's daily routine became increasingly rigid and ritualistic, with specific times for meals, exercise, and what the boys called educational activities that took place in private areas of the house where servants were not permitted to go. Mrs. Whitmore reported that Margaret had begun showing signs of what appeared to be complete psychological dependence on her brothers. The child could not make even the simplest decisions: what clothes to wear, what books to read, even when to use the bathroom, without first obtaining permission from Edmund Jr. or Charles. "She's like a puppet that only moves when they pull the strings," Mrs. Whitmore wrote to her sister in December 1882. "The bright, lively child she used to be has been replaced by something that barely seems human. She responds only to her brothers' voices, follows only their instructions, and shows no sign of independent thought or feeling." Even more troubling were the changes in Margaret's physical appearance that suggested her brother's care was having detrimental effects on her health and development. She had become pale and thin, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested chronic sleep deprivation. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if every action required considerable effort. But the most disturbing change was in Margaret's eyes, which had lost the brightness and curiosity typical of children her age. She looked at the world with the flat, empty gaze of someone who had given up all hope of independence or self-determination. The household staff began to notice that the children's nighttime activities had become increasingly unusual. Servants reported hearing strange sounds coming from the nursery wing during the early hours of the morning, not the normal sounds of children playing, but rhythmic chanting and movements that suggested some form of ceremony or ritual. Thomas Ashworth, making his rounds of the estate grounds, observed lights moving through the nursery windows at times when the children should have been sleeping. When he investigated more closely, he saw shadows moving in patterns that suggested formal, choreographed activities, rather than normal childhood behaviour. "It looked like they were dancing," he reported to Mrs. Whitmore. "But not like any dance I've ever seen children do. They moved in circles, with the little miss in the centre, and there was something about the way they positioned themselves that reminded me of the old stone circles on the moors, ancient things that were old when my grandfather's grandfather was young." The children's relationship to the portrait that had been taken the previous summer also became increasingly significant to their daily routine. They would spend long periods standing before the image, studying it with an intensity that seemed to border on worship. Sometimes they would arrange themselves in the exact positions depicted in the photograph, as if using it as a guide for proper behaviour and relationships. Mrs. Whitmore noticed that the boys seemed to use the portrait as a form of proof or validation for their treatment of Margaret. When questioned about their restrictive control over their sister, they would point to the image and explain that it showed the natural and proper relationship between them. "The portrait shows the truth about our family," Edmund Jr. would say when challenged about Margaret's isolation. "It documents how we're meant to be together, how we're supposed to take care of her. Anyone can see that this is the way things should be." Charles would support his brother's arguments by noting details in the photograph that supposedly justified their behaviour. "Look at how comfortable Margaret appears when we're protecting her," he would explain. "See how naturally she accepts our guidance. The camera captured our true relationship, the one that exists beneath all the pretense and social convention." But servants who looked closely at the portrait began to see things in the image that contradicted the boys' interpretations. Margaret's expression, while appropriately demure for Victorian standards, carried undertones of resignation and fear that became more apparent the longer one studied the photograph. The positioning of the boys, rather than suggesting protection, began to look increasingly like imprisonment. Their hands on Margaret's shoulders appeared to be restraining rather than comforting, and their expressions carried hints of possessiveness that seemed inappropriate for brothers caring for their sister. As Christmas approached, Mrs. Whitmore made a decision that would ultimately lead to the revelation of the truth about the Ashford children's relationship. Deeply concerned about Margaret's deteriorating condition, and convinced that something terrible was being planned for the child, she decided to conduct her own investigation into the boys' activities and the family traditions they claimed to be following. Her research in the estate's extensive library revealed disturbing information about the Ashford family history that had been carefully concealed from public knowledge for generations. The family had maintained connections to occult practices and supernatural beliefs that dated back to the medieval period. Traditions that involved the use of family members as participants in rituals designed to preserve and enhance the clan's power and prosperity. Most horrifying was Mrs. Whitmore's discovery of records documenting the disappearances of several young women from the Ashford family over the centuries. Girls who had reached their 11th birthdays and then vanished under mysterious circumstances, always during winter solstice celebrations that were described in cryptic terms as family obligations and sacred duties. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Young Ashford women would disappear at age 11, usually during December rituals that were supposedly designed to ensure the family's continued success and prosperity. The missing girls were never found, never mentioned again in family records, as if they had been erased from existence entirely. Margaret's 11th birthday was approaching on December 20th, just 3 days before the winter solstice. Mrs. Whitmore realised with growing horror that she had uncovered evidence of a family tradition that involved the systematic sacrifice of young women to maintain some form of supernatural power or protection. The portrait that had been taken the previous summer was not simply a family photograph. It was documentation of Margaret's final months before she would fulfil what her brothers believed to be her destined role in continuing centuries of family tradition. The innocent-looking image had captured the beginning of a process that would culminate in the child's disappearance and possible death. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to alert authorities about her discoveries were frustrated by the family's social position and the incredible nature of her claims. Local constables were reluctant to investigate accusations of supernatural practices against one of the county's most respected families, especially when the evidence consisted primarily of old family records and the subjective observations of household staff. But Mrs. Whitmore was determined to save Margaret from whatever fate her brothers had planned for her. On the night of December 19th, the evening before Margaret's 11th birthday, she made the desperate decision to confront the boys directly and demand that they abandon whatever ceremony they were planning for their sister. What she discovered that night would confirm her worst fears about the Ashford family's dark traditions and set in motion events that would culminate in Margaret's mysterious disappearance and the revelation of secrets that had been hidden for centuries. The confrontation between Mrs. Whitmore and the Ashford boys took place in the nursery wing of Blackmore House during the early hours of December 20th, 1882, Margaret's 11th birthday, and the beginning of what would prove to be the most horrifying 24 hours in the estate's long and troubled history. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the evening of December 19th making careful preparations for what she knew would be a dangerous intervention. She had written detailed letters to her sister documenting everything she had discovered about the family's dark traditions, letters that would be found only after her own mysterious disappearance 3 days later. She had also prepared a hiding place for Margaret in the estate's abandoned mill building, hoping to remove the child from her brother's influence until outside authorities could be convinced to investigate. But when Mrs. Whitmore entered the nursery at 2 o'clock in the morning, expecting to find the children sleeping, she instead discovered Edmund Jr. and Charles engaged in what could only be described as ritual preparation. The room had been completely transformed from a normal Victorian nursery into something that resembled a ceremonial chamber. The furniture had been rearranged to create a circular pattern around a central space where Margaret stood motionless, dressed in a white gown that looked more like a burial shroud than nightwear. The boys moved around their sister in carefully choreographed patterns, speaking in a language that Mrs. Whitmore didn't recognize, but which seemed ancient and deeply disturbing. Margaret herself appeared to be in some form of trance state, her eyes open but unfocused, her breathing slow and regular, as if she were in deep sleep despite standing upright. She showed no awareness of Mrs. Whitmore's presence or any reaction to the strange ceremony taking place around her. When Edmund Jr. and Charles noticed the housekeeper's intrusion, their reaction was immediate and terrifying. Both boys turned toward her with expressions of such cold fury that Mrs. Whitmore instinctively stepped backward, suddenly aware that she was confronting something far more dangerous than simply disturbed children. "You should not have come here tonight," Edmund Jr. said in a voice that seemed too mature and too controlled for a 14-year-old boy. "This is a family matter that does not concern servants or outsiders. Margaret belongs to us, and tonight she will fulfill the purpose for which she was born." Charles moved closer to Mrs. Whitmore, his young face displaying an intensity of malevolence that seemed impossible in someone so young. "You cannot stop what has been planned for generations," he said with quiet certainty. "Our sister will take her place in the family tradition, just as the others did before her. Her sacrifice will ensure our prosperity and power for another generation." Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to reason with the boys, to appeal to whatever remained of normal human feeling in them, met with responses that convinced her she was dealing with children who had been completely consumed by something inhuman and evil. "Margaret is your sister," she pleaded desperately. "You're supposed to love and protect her, not whatever you're planning to do. She's just a child, an innocent little girl who trusts you completely." Edmund Jr.'s laugh was cold and empty, carrying no trace of the boyish humour that should have characterised someone his age. "Love?" he repeated mockingly. "What we feel for Margaret goes far beyond anything as simple as love. We possess her completely, body and soul. She exists for us, belongs to us in ways that ordinary families could never understand." Charles nodded in agreement, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Whitmore's face. "The portrait captured the truth about our relationship," he explained with disturbing calm. "Margaret has always been ours to control and eventually to sacrifice. That's her purpose, her destiny, the reason she was born into this family." The boys' casual discussion of sacrificing their sister filled Mrs. Whitmore with horror, but also with determination to save Margaret regardless of the personal cost. She moved toward the child, hoping to break whatever trance held her and lead her away from the nightmare that her brothers had prepared. But Margaret's reaction to Mrs. Whitmore's approach revealed the complete extent of the psychological control that Edmund Jr. and Charles had established over their sister. Instead of responding with relief or recognition, Margaret recoiled from the housekeeper as if she were a stranger or threat. "Please don't interfere," Margaret said in a voice so empty of emotion that it seemed to come from a mechanical device rather than a living child. "My brothers know what's best for me. I need to do what they've planned. It's my duty to the family." Mrs. Whitmore realised with crushing despair that Margaret had been so thoroughly conditioned by her brother's manipulation that she had lost the ability to recognise rescue when it was offered. The child had been transformed into a willing participant in her own destruction, convinced that her sacrifice was not only necessary but desirable. The housekeeper's final attempt to save Margaret involved a desperate physical struggle with the boys, trying to reach the child and carry her bodily from the room. But Edmund Jr. and Charles displayed strength and coordination that seemed impossible for children their ages, moving with supernatural speed and power to prevent any interference with their plans. The struggle was brief and decisive. Mrs. Whitmore found herself overpowered and restrained by boys who should have been no match for an adult woman, held motionless while they completed their preparations for whatever ceremony they had planned for their sister. "You will remain here and witness what happens to those who interfere with family traditions," Edmund Jr. told her with calm finality. "Your fate will serve as a lesson to anyone else who might consider disrupting our sacred duties." What followed was the culmination of months of preparation and generations of family tradition, a ceremony that Mrs. Whitmore would survive to document, but which would haunt her for the few remaining days of her life. The boys resumed their ritual movements around Margaret, speaking in the ancient language that seemed to draw its power from sources far older than human civilization. As they continued their ceremony, changes began to occur in the room that defied rational explanation. The temperature dropped dramatically, creating a cold so intense that Mrs. Whitmore's breath became visible and frost began forming on the windows, despite the fires that had been burning in the fireplaces. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe and charged with an energy that made every surface in the room vibrate with subtle but persistent tremors. Most disturbing of all were the shadows that began moving independently of the people casting them, writhing and twisting in patterns that suggested the presence of entities that existed beyond normal human perception. The room filled with whispers in languages that had been dead for centuries, voices that spoke of hunger and ancient bargains that bound families across generations. As the ceremony reached its climax, Margaret began to change in ways that challenged Mrs. Whitmore's understanding of what was possible. The child's physical presence seemed to become less substantial, as if she were slowly fading from the world of the living into something else entirely. But Margaret was not simply disappearing. She was being transformed, becoming something that existed between the world of the living and whatever realm her brothers were opening through their ritual. Her eyes began to glow with an unnatural light, and her voice, when she spoke, carried harmonies that suggested multiple consciousnesses sharing the same physical form. "I understand now," Margaret said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is what I was meant for. This is why I was born into this family. My brothers have always known what I was destined to become." The final moment of the ceremony occurred at precisely sunrise on December 20th, as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the frost-covered windows of the nursery. Margaret looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore with eyes that held centuries of accumulated knowledge and infinite sadness. "Tell them I was happy," she said in her own childish voice, suddenly sounding like the 10-year-old girl she had been before her brother's manipulation began. "Tell them I went willingly to my destiny." And then Margaret Ashford simply ceased to exist, not vanishing in any dramatic fashion, but simply becoming absent, as if she had never been in the room at all. Where she had stood, only empty air remained, though the white gown she had worn fell to the floor in a perfectly arranged circle, as if her body had simply evaporated from within her clothes. Edmund Jr. and Charles showed no distress at their sister's disappearance. Instead, they displayed satisfaction and renewed energy. As if Margaret's transformation had somehow strengthened them, they began cleaning up the evidence of their ceremony with efficient practice movements that suggested they had always known exactly what would happen. "The family tradition continues," Edmund Jr. said with quiet satisfaction as he carefully folded Margaret's abandoned gown. "Our prosperity is assured for another generation, and Margaret has fulfilled the purpose for which she was created." Charles nodded approvingly as he restored the nursery furniture to its normal arrangement. "She served the family well," he agreed. "Her sacrifice will be remembered in the ways that matter, even if her individual existence is forgotten by those who lack understanding of our true nature." Mrs. Whitmore, released from whatever force had held her motionless during the ceremony, attempted to flee the room and raise an alarm about what she had witnessed. But she discovered that her memory of the night's events was already beginning to fade, becoming vague and dreamlike, as if the ceremony had included provisions for protecting the family's secrets from outside interference. By the time she reached the main floor of the house, Mrs. Whitmore could remember only that she had been concerned about Margaret's welfare and had gone to check on the children during the night. The specific details of what she had witnessed, the ritual, the transformation, the boy's supernatural abilities, had been erased from her conscious memory, leaving behind only a growing sense of dread and the certainty that something terrible had happened to Margaret. The official investigation into Margaret Ashford's disappearance began the following morning when Mrs. Whitmore reported that the child's bed had not been slept in and that she could not be found anywhere on the estate. Local constables conducted a thorough search of Blackmore House and the surrounding moorlands, but found no trace of the missing girl. Edmund Jr. and Charles participated in the search with appropriate concern and cooperation, providing detailed accounts of their sister's activities the previous day and expressing the proper degree of worry about her welfare. Their parents were devastated by Margaret's disappearance, but their grief was complicated by the boys' seemingly genuine confusion about what might have happened to their sister. "Margaret was perfectly safe with us yesterday evening," Edmund Jr. told the investigating constables with convincing sincerity. "We spent the evening together as we always do, reading and discussing her lessons. She seemed completely normal when we said goodnight." Charles supported his brother's account with equal conviction. "We would never let anything happen to Margaret," he insisted. "She's our responsibility, our precious sister. We've devoted our lives to protecting her." The boys' apparent distress and their consistent testimonies about Margaret's last known activities created a puzzle that the local authorities could not solve. There was no evidence of an intruder, no signs of struggle, and no indication that Margaret had attempted to leave the house voluntarily. She had simply vanished without explanation. Mrs. Whitmore's own testimony was limited by her incomplete memory of the night's events. She could report only her growing concerns about the family dynamics and her discovery that Margaret was missing from her room. The specific details that might have revealed the truth about the boy's involvement remained locked away in portions of her memory that had been somehow sealed against conscious access. The investigation continued for several weeks, with search parties combing the Yorkshire moors for any trace of the missing child. Rewards were offered, neighbouring counties were alerted, and every possible lead was followed with the thoroughness appropriate to a case involving such a prominent family. But Margaret Ashford was never found, never seen again, never mentioned in any subsequent documentation except as the tragic child who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances during the winter of 1882. The portrait that had been taken the previous summer became a memorial to the lost child, hung now in the main drawing room, not as a celebration of family unity, but as a reminder of tragedy and loss. Visitors to Blackmore House would study the image with fascination and sadness, commenting on how beautiful and innocent Margaret had appeared in her final photograph. But those who looked closely at the portrait began to notice something that had not been apparent when it was first displayed. Margaret's expression in the photograph seemed to have changed subtly, becoming more resigned and fearful, as if the image itself was somehow reflecting knowledge of what was to come. Even more disturbing was the way Edmund Jr. and Charles appeared in the portrait after their sister's disappearance. Their protective stances had taken on predatory qualities, and their expressions carried hints of satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for brothers grieving a lost sister. Mrs. Whitmore, whose fragmented memories left her with persistent nightmares and growing certainty that she had witnessed something terrible, began experiencing psychological deterioration that concerned other members of the household staff. She would spend hours staring at Margaret's portrait, claiming to see things in the image that others could not perceive. "She's trying to tell us something," Mrs. Whitmore would insist to anyone who would listen. "Margaret is still there in the photograph trying to warn us about what her brothers really are. If you look carefully, you can see the truth about what happened to her." 3 days after Margaret's disappearance, Mrs. Whitmore herself vanished during the night, leaving behind only the letters she had written to her sister documenting her discoveries about the Ashford family's dark traditions. Her disappearance was investigated with the same thoroughness as Margaret's, but with equally unsuccessful results. The double tragedy that struck Blackmore House in December 1882 was attributed to the stress and instability that can affect isolated households during difficult periods. The official conclusion was that Margaret had somehow wandered onto the dangerous moorlands and perished in the harsh winter weather, while Mrs. Whitmore had suffered a nervous breakdown that led her to flee the scene of a tragedy she felt responsible for failing to prevent. Edmund Jr. and Charles continued their lives at Blackmore House with appropriate displays of grief for their lost sister, but servants noticed that both boys seemed healthier and more energetic after Margaret's disappearance, as if her absence had somehow strengthened rather than weakened them. The boys' academic performance improved dramatically, their social confidence increased, and they began displaying leadership qualities that seemed to emerge from nowhere. It was as if Margaret's disappearance had released capabilities in her brothers that had previously been dormant or suppressed. When Edmund Jr. inherited the estate following his father's death in 1895, he proved to be an exceptionally successful businessman whose investments and ventures produced wealth that exceeded even the family's historical prosperity. Charles became his brother's partner and advisor, demonstrating financial acumen that seemed almost supernatural in its consistent success. Both brothers remained bachelors throughout their lives, showing no romantic interest in women and dedicating themselves entirely to preserving and expanding the family's power and influence. They lived as if they had absorbed not only Margaret's life force, but her capacity for forming human connections outside their exclusive sibling bond. The portrait of the three children remained displayed in Blackmore House until the estate was finally sold in 1923 following Charles's death. The new owners, unfamiliar with the tragic history associated with the image, kept the portrait as part of the house's historical character. But visitors to the house began reporting disturbing experiences related to the photograph. Children who saw the image became upset and claimed to see a fourth figure in the portrait, a young girl standing behind the three documented subjects, trying to attract attention to her presence. Adults who studied the photograph for extended periods reported dreams in which Margaret Ashford appeared to them, describing in detail the ritual that had led to her disappearance and warning them about the true nature of her surviving brothers. These reports were dismissed as imagination and folklore until 1967, when the house was converted into a museum and the portrait was subjected to modern photographic analysis. Experts discovered that the image contained layers of information that had not been visible to Victorian-era observers, including evidence of a fourth figure that appeared to have been somehow obscured or suppressed in the original photograph. The hidden figure was clearly that of a young girl, positioned behind the three visible children, but somehow rendered nearly invisible through processes that modern experts could not explain. Computer enhancement revealed that this fourth figure was reaching toward the viewer, her mouth open as if crying out for help or trying to communicate some urgent message. Today, more than 140 years after the Ashford siblings' portrait was taken, it remains one of the most disturbing and mysterious examples of Victorian photography. The image serves as a permanent record of a family tragedy that was hidden for generations, evidence of secrets that challenge our understanding of the bonds between siblings and the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most innocent-appearing family relationships. Margaret Ashford was never found because she had been transformed into something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality, sacrificed by brothers who loved her so possessively that they preferred to consume her entirely rather than risk losing her to the outside world. The portrait that was meant to celebrate their sibling bond became instead documentation of the most complete form of ownership possible, the absorption of one human being into the spiritual essence of others. The innocent-looking photograph continues to hang in what was once Blackmore House, now a museum where visitors can study the image and try to understand how family love can become so twisted that it transforms protection into predation and devotion into damnation. The story of the 1882 siblings' portrait serves as a warning about the dangers of possessive love and the horror that can result when family bonds become chains that bind rather than connections that nurture. Margaret Ashford's disappearance reminds us that some forms of love are so consuming that they destroy what they claim to protect. and that the most dangerous predators are often those who convince their victims that victimization is actually salvation.